Good morning and welcome to Jew in the City Speaks with your host, Allison Josephs, also known as Jew in the City. With Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, approaching, there is a question that probably many of us have on our minds. We say never again, but do we really mean it? Can we really mean it? In the last several years, anti-Semitism has been rising in drastic ways all over the world. The ADL in March put out the numbers of attacks in 2023. They were 2.5 times higher than they were in 2022, which was the highest time since they had started recording. That had already probably started in 2021. So can we say never again if maybe we're getting, God forbid, closer to the again? To break down the historic patterns that took us to the horrific times of Hitler's Germany and notice what's happening now and maybe what we can do about it, hopefully what's different, we will hopefully better understand our situation today. Joining me is a guest we've had on before who is always wonderful to talk to. His name is Dr. Joshua Cartlip. He is the Herbert S. and Naomi Denenberg Professor of Jewish History and the Associate Director for the Center of Israel Studies at Yeshiva University. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Cartlip.
Thank you so much, Allison. It's always great to talk to you and to be on your podcast, but of course not about this grim topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My husband was a history major, and I was never so interested in history until I started realizing how important history is for like the present and the future. It's not just some like boring factoids in a book. The more that we understand the patterns of the past, the more we can hopefully make better decisions in the future. And I really appreciated our past conversations, and I look forward to our conversation today. So, your time period, because I think the thing about historians is that everybody sort of focuses on their time and their place. You intersect with this part of Europe in this time that we are interested in. So 1930s Germany, I guess 1920s Germany, things were not as bad. And then we hear about 1930s Germany and things got worse. So what was the change and what was happening to Jews and what do we see similar today?
Well, I think it's important, Allison, to realize, that the Holocaust didn't happen in a vacuum, and even though it seems that, things got worse very quickly, which ostensibly, overtly they did, you have all the ingredients in the background. And so the ingredients in the background were that racial anti-Semitism had begun in Germany in the 1870s. This was a backlash to Jewish success, to Jews successfully integrating into the German society, into the German economy, into German culture, and they did everything that they were told to do. In other words, you want to be citizens, so you have to assimilate, you have to give up your language, you have to reform your religion, you have to, do all of these, and then they're slapped with you've assimilated too much, you're taking our jobs, you're taking, and but this was a peripheral phenomenon in Germany for quite a while. Um, and it took a long time for it to become mainstream. So we're talking about something that when the League of Anti-Semites was formed in 1879, and that was the first, Wilhelm Marr was the first one to use the term anti-Semites, and he was terming it in terms of racial Jewish identity. That's why he called us Semites. He only garnered 2,000 signatures, in a population of tens of millions of Germans. But, 50 years later, by 50 years later, Hitler could come to power on this very ideology and it could become mainstream. So, I think that the parallel, if you're looking for parallels, is that roughly 50 years ago, post 67 war, in the 70s, the Palestinians realized that they hadn't gotten anywhere uniting with the far right. During the Holocaust, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the Palestinian Arabs had been united with the Germans, and they had been united with the right. The Mufti of Jerusalem famously spent the war years in Berlin and was buddies with Hitler. And somewhere along the line, starting in the 60s, but really in the early 70s, the Palestinians rebrand themselves as a liberationist, leftist, Marxist movement. And they find right away that this rebranding makes them the darling child of the left. But it was the far left. It was the far left and, you know, the liberal mainstream and even the moderate left, even, to the left of the liberal mainstream, was still pro-Israel. But gradually, slowly, over this 50-year period, they've moved their way into the mainstream until it's overtaken the left and it's now moving into, the liberal center, in terms of, let's say, the Democratic Party, et cetera, where it's no longer the fringe left anymore. And so, you had in 1975 the Zionism is racism UN resolution, which was Soviet orchestrated, right? But, people in the West and in the United States, it didn't gain very much traction in the US except with far left groups. But now, 50 years later, this is a mainstream position in academia, in universities, amongst young people. And unfortunately, the more educated the young people are, the more likely they are to believe in this. So
Educated with propaganda.
educated, supposedly educated, right, with propaganda. In the meantime, quietly, whereas now we're hearing all about these anti-Semitic charges that Jews have bought the universities and Jews are trying to stifle free speech in universities, which was, we knew that was going to be the backlash to when Jews pushed back rightly to the terrible anti-Semitism post October 7th. But the reality is that it was Qatari money, and a lot of money from oil-rich Gulf states that really bought up whole Middle Eastern departments in major American universities over the last number of decades, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, to the point that you have a monolithic perspective, that's anti-Israel.
I want to jump in on what you said before about Jews were taking the jobs and then they were rebranded as racially inferior in order to try to push them out. So
Right.
outside of the Israel conversation, although still related to the Israel conversation, because is Israelis and Jews that, both live there, both emigrated there recently, or kind of all Jews do get labeled as white European colonialists. But the pattern that seems so obvious in America is there does seem to be a decreasing of Jews in university spaces, in professional spaces. There was an article written in The Atlantic a couple of months ago, "The golden age of American Jewry is over." We're now being pushed out of positions of power or influence due to being too white. And with this idea, a seemingly nice idea about diversity, I mean, who can't get behind diversity, but diversity now being yet another tool to quash Jewish power. So is that a similarity?
100%. I think that there's certain patterns here that, as a historian, I like to say two things. It's not really true that history repeats itself because it never repeats itself exactly. But it's also true what William Faulkner said, about the South, that, the past is not dead. It's not in the South, it's not even the past. I think we can say the same thing about the history of anti-Semitism. I think that what we're seeing is the same, where we thought we outlived the moment, of the 1930s or the 1940s. We were really taking a break. We were taking a lull. And, in a sense, this is a continuation of the same process. And that's why we're seeing what seems to be a repetition when in reality it's the same process. Um, and what part of that process is that how amorphous anti-Semitism is, and how it keeps it keeps changing, and we get charged with everything and its opposite. Um,
Mhm.
and everything, very often, the tools that we use to defend ourselves end up being turned against us. And those tools, our enemies manage to co-opt those tools in the war against the Jews. So let me give you, an example. Many Jews at the turn of the 20th century in Russia and in other countries, but especially in Russia, turned to the revolutionary movement. Now why did so many turn to the revolutionary movement? They, some were really, really bought into the ideology, but many more adopted communism or or socialism and communism because it was the only movement that promised equality for the Jews. In other words, in a intensely anti-Semitic um, Tsarist Russia, the only way that Jews could possibly gain equality would be to totally overthrow the system and create a system where everybody would be equal. And so that explains the disproportionate, even though most Jews weren't revolutionaries, it explains the disproportionate percentage of Jews within the revolutionary movement. And of course, it was a vicious cycle. The more the Tsarist regime persecuted the Jews and accused them of being disloyal, the more joined the revolutionary movement. Um, but then, our enemies very successfully said all Jews are Judeo-Bolsheviks. All Jews are Bolsheviks, and this myth of the Judeo-Bolshevik came into being. So, this movement that was supposed to protect us ends up being a movement that becomes really a demonization that leads to the mass murder of Jews in the pogroms in the Russian Civil War. At least 100,000 Jews were murdered, probably a lot more, between 1917 and 1921 in Ukraine. Um, and Jeffrey Weidlinger, I've mentioned this to you in past podcasts, saw this as the onset of the Holocaust, as a trial run for the Holocaust. It certainly explains why so many of the East European nationalities joined in such large numbers in the final solution. They didn't buy into Nazi racial ideology. But they did buy into this myth of the Judeo-Bolsheviks. So they picked up where they left off in 1941, when the Germans came in. Now, why I say that is that it got turned against us. This was something that the Jews had hoped, Bolshevism, that would lead to Jewish equality. Not only did it, crush Judaism and ultimately post World War II turn actually anti-Semitic,
I was going to
against
ask you about that. Yeah, because I think
right,
that not only are we blamed for being communists and Bolsheviks, they turned against us too. So I see the
exactly.
very clear pattern of Jews being liberal in order to find an equality movement that will protect us. How
Right.
many Jews have marched with every other group, stood in solidarity with them, and then when it was time to march with Jews, Jews are looking around and saying, "Where are my allies at?" So,
Exactly. Exactly. And not only that, the very ideology of diversity, right, which is something that was pushed by Jews, Jews were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. Jews were marching as recently as 2.5 summers ago, or was it 4 summers, almost 4 years ago, after the George Floyd riots, in the very same, in Teaneck, right? So Teaneck, the very community that's been under attack, recently by anti-Israel protesters, Jews were marching. All the Orthodox schools were marching with in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter, and so in other words, but this very ideology of diversity got turned against us. In other words, what about the Palestinians? And you're oppressing the Palestinians, and you Jews are white, and Palestinians are people of color.
yeah. So, how and why did the Bolsheviks turn against us? Because I feel like that could be also very helpful in terms of understanding the modern, far left, which is bleeding into the Democratic Party. How did that
Right.
happen in the past?
Exactly. So first of all, we have to understand in what ways the Bolsheviks were with us, ever with us, right? They were not with us in terms of promoting Judaism or promoting Jewish culture or Zionism. In fact, the only way a Jew could survive in the Soviet Union, even from 1917, is if he or she disavowed Judaism as a religion, disavowed Zionism, disavowed Hebrew, right? And so, I think, there definitely are some, a lot of parallels in terms of from the very get-go, in terms of the far left, that, you can only join if you are, not an openly, religious Jew, or an openly, certainly not an Orthodox Jew, or, a proud Zionist. But eventually, but it is true that the Bolsheviks initially protected Jewish life. That Lenin stopped pogroms in the Red Army, and it was only the Red Army in that Russian Civil War that protected Jewish life. Now, what that did is it drove Jews into the arms of the Bolsheviks, because there was no other alternative. It was either the Bolsheviks or get murdered, right? So the rest of the Jew, there was a small minority that had been pro-Bolshevik before 1917. The rest of them became pro-Soviet only as a tactic to keep themselves alive. So to them, it was a conservative tactic. It was the same way, like, Jews ally with the government powers. They had to ally with the Soviet power to protect them. But then, when once that happened, and the Soviets realized that, they had the power in the relationship, the Jews needed them far more than they needed the Jews. And especially after World War II, when many Soviet Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, in the areas that the Nazis reached, right? Not the areas that were held on by the Soviets. But at that point, there was a backlash. And at that point, the Soviets said, okay, there have been too many Jews in professional roles, in government jobs, because after all, in the aftermath of the revolution, they needed a loyal group, because there were so many other ethnicities that were that had been pro-Tsar. So, the Jews are a good bet to put in government jobs in the 20s, because the Jews had been, of course, the Jew wasn't going to be pro-Tsar or want the Tsar back. But by 1947, by 1950, what the people in government are saying is, okay, now we have to give our own people a turn. And by that point, there are Ukrainians who reach the upper echelons of government, who are saying, okay, let's get these Jews out of here, and let's get some of our own people in there. So there's a backlash at the Jewish success, and there's a purge. And there's a purge.
Literally the same story over and over and over
Yes,
again.
yes. And I think we're seeing, look, I mean, I don't want to compare the United States in 2024 to the Soviet Union, but we are seeing some echoes of that, in terms of what you said, that, these studies of, where are, there was 30% of the student body at Ivy League schools, Harvard and others, were Jewish, and suddenly it's gone way down.
But now
Where,
let's go back to Germany now, because that was
yeah,
the original topic. So also there were quotas in Germany in the 1930s. So now let's go
oh
to
yeah.
that part of the world in that decade.
Well, Germany was even more than quotas. Germany, they were completely, in Germany, quite early on, and I believe it was 1935, Jews were completely banned from German universities, and from German schools. So there was utter segregation, a complete expulsion. You
Did that
know,
happen overnight? Was there like first a quashing of Jews, and then ultimately the spigot was turned off? Or, you know what I'm saying? Was it a process, or did it happen one day, a law was enacted, and then Jews were out of every public space?
I think, you see, Germany, in a sense, is not, as of this moment, what's going to be in America in 6 months, post-election or whatever, I can't, nobody can say. But as of now, Germany is not the perfect analogy, because in Germany there was a coup, right, by Hitler, right, who squashed a democratic uh, republic, the Weimar Republic, which had been good to Jews, right? Um, and it was he and the Nazis who established one party rule, and then enacted these rules, the segregation, etc. I think a more accurate parallel for now would be the universities in, let's say, Poland, in the interwar period. Poland was a democracy. It was an imperfect democracy with some authoritarian tendencies, but it was a democracy, and there were heavy quotas against Jews, and even those Jews who made it into the universities became victims of violence. Now, in the Polish universities, it was the right wing, and Polish university students tended to be very right wing, and to organize boycotts against Jews, to threaten them with violence, and starting in the 30s, they enacted what they called ghetto benches, which meant all Jews, since all Jews are Bolsheviks, all Jews have to sit on the left of the lecture hall. And since Jews didn't want to have that indignity, Jewish students were standing the whole time, in the lecture halls, and many professors went along with it. Now, a parallel to that, we haven't gotten, thank God, to that, in America, but a parallel to that are, since October 7th, these violent demonstrations against Jews, this intimidation of Jews, doxing of Jews, and
And in Stanford, there was a professor that made the Jews like stand up and be segregated in the class and like
100%.
stare at the window.
Right,
I'm thinking about the quotas in the US around the same time in the Ivy Leagues. And I'm also thinking about wasn't there the Red Scare? Was that also in the US where they were accusing Jews of being communists as well?
100%, 100%. And the Red Scare in America, and then of course there was in the 50s where the McCarthy trials. This was this was an echo of what was going on in Europe on a much more brutal scale. But I have a lot of colleagues at secular universities. I'm blessed to be at Yeshiva University, the most pro-Israel, Zionist institution in the United States, institution of higher learning, I should say. But I went with a group of academics to Israel in January on a Jewish studies scholars mission to Israel in crisis. And we had professors from state universities, we had professors from Catholic universities, we had professors from private liberal arts colleges, and it was all the same story. That was what the uncanny thing. It's not just the intimidation of the anti-Israel protests. It's also that pro-Palestinian students are literally coming up to their Jewish dorm mates and are saying to them, there's going to be a rally for Palestine at such and such time and place, and essentially you better be there. And when the Jewish student, even if they're not kippah wearing, even if they don't go to Hillel, even if they're not affiliated, if they don't show up at that rally, next thing you know, they're being doxxed on social media. And in some cases, in many cases, at all of these places, swastikas are put under their dorm rooms. Young women are getting rape threats. And this is going on it doesn't matter if it's a liberal arts college or a Catholic university or a big public state college. This is the commonality. And it's going on all over the United States.
What about boycotts? In my mind, that's another, I would say blood libels and boycotts seemed like another thing that was happening in 1930s Germany. Are there similarities that we can
Yes,
see now?
the blood libel is ubiquitous now. The blood libel is ubiquitous. It's being directed against Israel. We have to remember that it was there even before Israel fired one shot in retaliation post October 7th. And now it's directed against any Jew. It's against any Jew. The perfect example is what happened to the dean of the law school at Berkeley last week, Chemerinsky, I believe his name is, right? And liberal guy, right? Strong believer in free speech. Believes in a two-state solution, which is passé, in for the anti-Israel crowd now, and he has students over for dinner, right? And there was a cartoon pasted all over the university of a caricature of him with a bloody knife and fork saying, don't eat at Zion with Zionist Shem while Gaza starves. And then, even though he said that he did not want any political speeches at the dinner, a pro-Palestinian, 10 pro-Palestinians signed up, knowing that, and hijacked.
Yep.
So that's an example of a blood libel just because he's Jewish, right? And it's going on all over the world.
Okay, and so movies were just starting to get made in the time of the Nazis. That was like brand new technology, and we
Oh,
know that Goebbels, as like the chief propaganda officer of the Nazi regime, was very excited with the possibility now. I mean, we're like light years away from the simple black and white films that, were hard, wasn't the same access. Every idiot has a phone that they can just point at and, edit things and do AI. What about that concern? Not just of like, the vilification of Jews for the blood libel, but the ubiquity of it and then the ability to amplify it all over the world in seconds.
100%. So since I know that our time is running out, I just want to say one quick thing first, and that is I do have to point out the key difference between now and America 2024 and Nazi Germany 1930s, and that is, thank God, the police are still protecting us, are still there for us. The government in general, although we may, we certainly, we may disagree vociferously at times with the Biden regime on its take in this war, they certainly are against open anti-Semitism in this country. What's going to happen, after the election, and what's going to be with the election, we don't know. Um, but I will say that in terms of what you said, I'm going to say something very grim, and that is you will read and hear in the media that the anti-Semitism worldwide was elicited by Israel's military response in Gaza, right? And the death of civilians in Gaza, who are really used as human shields, etc. I will tell you that that is completely not true. The anti-Semitism was elicited by the images that Hamas spread throughout the world on social media in live time while it was perpetrating its atrocities, right? And then they disappeared, from after a certain number of hours from social media. But what this did was it was a call to all the violent anti-Semites in the whole world. It was they tasted blood, right? And they came out, and it catalyzed them. And what it also did was lull the people in the middle. You know what I mean? It terrifies the Jews, it outrages the righteous people. It anesthetizes the masses in the middle, and it whets the appetite of the sadistic anti-Semites. So once it got out there, those images, that's when the euphoria came out. That's when you start, and it was before Israel fired a shot. So yes, that is the terrifying aspect, and that's the similarity. But it can be done with much greater alacrity today, and with much greater success. And then at the same time, you have two things going on. You have the whetting of the appetite with the atrocities, and then you have the denial of the atrocities, right? You have the denial of the atrocities and AI that tries to show that it's really Israel. Israel did it all, and it didn't exist, and things like that. And yes, it's very terrifying.
It is very terrifying. Final minute boycotts, similarities with boycotts in Germany of Jewish businesses and the boycotts we're seeing of Israel. Do you see similarities there?
Yes, yeah, sure. I see similarities. Again, the key difference is that our government is not behind it. Our government, pushes back against it. The question is, for how long will that be? And it's not, for me, the initial fear is not that our police, that our government will actively turn against these Jewish citizens. It's that it will be worn down by the intimidation of the anti-Semites to stop protecting us to the extent that we need to be protected. That's already happening in England. It's already happening in London. It's already happening in Paris.
All right. Well, I guess we just need to stay unified, pray, and really ask for Mashiach. I guess that's been the prayer of the Jewish people for 2,000 years, and we will continue that. Thank you for this sort of run through several decades of history, even though it's a little bit scary, but at least our eyes will be more wide open and aware of what to look out for. Thanks, and great talking to you as always.
Talk to you. We'll survive.
Amen. And thanks for listening. You can catch us same time, same place next week.